Okay, so we can get started now. Welcome everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining this event. I'm Gabriel Cuellar, an assistant professor of practice here at the University of Minnesota, and have the privilege to be organizing this event this week, which explores lowercase a architecture, diverse spatial material practices concerned with spatialities, constituencies, processes, and values beyond the presets of capital A architecture. I'm very pleased to welcome our second guest speaker, Alexandra Arènes. Welcome, Alexandra. Thank you so much for joining us. Our faculty and students are really excited to have you here and to work with you this week. And indeed, the workshop will be kicking off just after your talk today. Alexandra Arènes is an architect, a researcher, and co-founder of the Paris-based studio SOC, Société d'Objets Cartographiques. She studied at the National School of Architecture in Grenoble, where she has also taught, and the Sciences Po University in Paris. At the University of Manchester, with Professor Albena Janeva, Alexandra is currently undertaking a doctoral research project entitled Architectural Design at the Time of the Anthropocene, a Gaia-graphic approach to the critical zones. Alexandra has lectured internationally and recently published in journals Geohumanities and the Anthropocene Review. She contributed illustrations to Bruno Latour's 27 book, Down to Earth, and an essay in the Feral Atlas Digital Library, edited by Anna Singh. Together with Sohail Hajmir Baba and Axel Gregoire, Alexandra's design and research work in SOC explores how architecture and landscape engage with spaces, cycles, interactions, forms of life, and scientific study and the Anthropocene. A major ongoing exhibition at the Center for Arts and Media in Karlsruhe, Germany, Critical Zones, Observatories for Earthly Politics, emerges out of Alexandra's experimental territorial visualizations, a field she calls Gaia-graphy, which we have the pleasure to learn about today. Alexandra's relevant and important work in SOC was published in the 2019 book, Terra, Forma, a manual for potential cartographies, co-authored with Frédéric Ait-Touati and soon to be published in English by MIT Press. The book is filled with captivating illustrations and frameworks for speculation, offering ways to explore, represent, and engage with complex environments. Accounting for the more than human and the anthropogenic effects too often externalized in design fields, Alexandra posits a reorientation in which, in her words, ruined landscapes are the leftovers for potential futures. We have a Q&A following Alexandra's talk, which I'm looking forward to very much. If you're in the Zoom webinar, I invite you to pose questions in the Q&A. You can also raise your hand. And likewise in the YouTube, if you have a question, feel free to post it there. Thank you again, Alexandra. Welcome. And we turn to you now for the talk.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriel, for the invitation, and all the team also at the University of Minnesota for having me this week and the work together. So I will share my screen. Okay. So as Gabriel introduced, I will not maybe repeat. I just wanted to say that SOC, so it stands for Society Cartographic Objects. We begin to work as architects, planning designers, or landscape designers, and we face some issues. So at SOC, we wanted to explore the relationships between science, architecture, and art. And so that's why we work with philosophers, scientists, or artists. And we had the chance to work with Bruno Latour, who is a philosopher and sociologist, on projects such as the ZKM exhibition that I will talk a bit, and also on political workshops called Where to Land. And the book is also an experiment to visualize alternatively territories impacted by the Anthropocene. So actually, the lecture will focus on maps, maps that we once took for granted and that turn out to be different when we conceptually change the gaze on, or when we pragmatically follow the scientists of the critical zone and their sensors. And the critical zone, I will talk about it also in the talk, it's a science that helps us to understand the critical places on Earth where life is threatened and where the role of actors, human and non-human, are unclear. And this is this uncertainty which is perhaps a real challenge for architecture at the time of the Anthropocene in the coming years. So through the cartographies of the book Terra, Forma, the exhibition Critical Zone at the ZKM, which is itself stems from an ethnography of science in action. So I will explore some of these changes and how we can approach them as architects. So I've been working for some time in a landscape and urban design studio, and there was a first shift on the question of the relationship to space and to living entities. This shift of focus from the built environment as architect to the natural environment as landscapers led us to take an interest in things and beings that were not represented and overlooked by architectural tools. And the second significant aspect of this practice is that we mainly worked on large territorial projects with a map as a tool for analysis, representation, and design. We therefore started to question our way of conserving space and the map as a main working tool for diagnosis as well as for prospective studies. If we look briefly at some historical maps, we can understand how these artifacts tell the story of a construction of a gaze in relation to the political stakes and belief of an era. On the left, you can see the division of the earth between the sons of Noah, attributed to Simon Marmion and dating from the 15th century. It illustrates the belief that the earth was made up of 3 continents, and it gives the impression of being a factual map with cardinal points. On the right, all maps, this is all maps of the forest of Breteuil from the exhibition, View and Figure of the French Space, that shows a figurative writing that does not respect scales. It may seem unrealistic to us, and yet it serves to settle conflicts from a legal point of view on issues such as land ownership. So these maps were descriptive tools, and this is what interests us in these examples as a tool for conceptualizing a space to be delimited, developed, defended, informed, and described. Just to say that the referential of the North, which seems obvious today, came late in history. So this is a map of Paris, and the North is not, above. This is also an ancient map saying places that have not been registered. And it's interesting to see that maps follow also the knowledge of the epoch and to map spaces that hasn't been discovered. And the maps and images we know and use as architects, urban planners and landscape designers are very often these aerial maps, a view that seems realistic and precise, but which is captured from a space where nobody lives, a point of view that some researchers call a point of view from nowhere. And the second observation is that working on landscape-related subjects means taking an interest in visiting, studying, and representing the blank spaces on maps. And when you open this kind of map, the landscape is kind of a void, and the vegetation remains in a homogeneous green area. So working on these green areas is therefore to realize that there is an invisible world, and especially to be surprised by the depopulated aspect of our cartographic representation systems. The territory is not empty, but the maps are. We have gradually become aware that we have a responsibility in this respect, since the way we represent the territory conditions our actions on it. And so the consequence of this invisibilization is the promotion of the conquest of space. These visualizations of the Earth are indeed based on ancient cartographic and geological images conceived as a tool of colonization, a way of writing the story of a conquest where the civilized takes possession of territories that are supposedly empty, but which must always be emptied because they are already and always populated. Alternatively, how to think with maps as a decolonized tool. Here is an interesting example from the Decolonized Atlas website, which shows a map with the Indian names of places in Minneapolis. And here are two maps of North America that are alternative to the borders. One is a geological map and the other a map of the bioregions. A bioregion is a geographic area that is defined by natural features like common species assemblages, watersheds, or terrain, and which often overlaps with cultures. But most of our systems of representation have been created to grasp land resources, where the space seems to be available, not only in extension, but also in depth. The consequence of that is obviously the Anthropocene, which can be understood as a climate crisis, but also as a crisis of representation. Exploring the Earth today means first of all trying to repopulate the maps, to repatriate in our systems of representation and in our histories the entities excluded from the geological imagination in order to inhabit a shared space populated by other living beings. Will our maps offer a space where to land? Can they describe the planet we live on, but maybe not the globe, but the critical zone? Can we better live in this damaged world, as Anat Singh will put it? It is often assumed that the soil is stable, but from a geological point of view, it moves. It is exposed to the pressures of tectonic plates, water, and organisms, and therefore it crumbles, slides, and collapses. The problem is that humans are accelerating this movement of the soil. We know, for example, that the erosion caused by human settlements is 1.5 times higher than that of nature. In the Anthropocene, humans became the first geological force to dramatically impact the soil. Humans generate layers of concrete, plastic, dig holes far away to urbanize cities here, import fertilizers to feed soils here that have become sterile through overexploitation. These effects of the Anthropocene are not so much visible in the stable pacified state of the space. In order to show them, Zalazevich, geologist and chair of the Anthropocene Working Group, suggests quantifying these effects by giving weight to materials modified or generated by human activities, not only the waste, but also the earth movements, the consumption of rare materials, and the release of CO2 into the atmosphere. How then might architects approach these questions? As the anthropologist Arturo Escobar invites us, it is necessary to detach design from its anthropocentric and rationalist basis and turn it into a weapon against the unsustainable development that reigns in the modern world. So it is most often assumed that only humans have the ability to transform a landscape. But beavers, for example, are also skilled at transforming the morphology of the landscape. We are not alone in modifying our environment to make it habitable. We see here a physical example, but let's take as an example the bacteria that models the chemical composition of our atmosphere and make it breathable. The discovery is a Gaia hypothesis, the result of a cooperative work between a biochemist, Lynn Margulis here, and a geochemist, Lovelock, in the 70s. And since recently, this theory has been taken up by Bruno Latour and Wong researchers. And the important thing is that this hypothesis suggests that space, the environment that we take as a stable framework, or as a background or as a vessel for our activities is in fact produced by the living beings themselves. So we are not including it, but we are making it. Natural beings are the ones that maintain the atmosphere as it is. They are also partly responsible for the production of rocks and for the global recycling of earth materials. And hence a certain plasticity and hence stability of the earth. And that's why the earth is in kind of permanent terraformation. So terraformation is a term that is originally referring to the action of making an uninhabitable planet habitable by technical means. It's referring to Mars. But here we are trying to reverse it. We are not limiting this potential of terraformation for humans, but to all non-humans, living and non-living. And it is also a question of recognizing the power of transformation for all living beings. So hence the use of this term in the title of the book Terra Forma, which I will now discuss. So the main question of Terra Forma is the following. How does cartographic space represent not only where the living beings are situated in the map, but also how they themselves generate their living space? The aim of the book is to reopen the practice of cartographies, or rather potential cartographies, that is, possible maps, not definitive, but always in the process of making them. Here is the table of contents. We imagined 7 models for alternatively mapping landscapes in the Anthropocene, with teams to approach it in design thinking. So in short, the book suggests extending the traditional cartographic vocabulary in order to progressively and collectively constitute an atlas of a new kind and to make room in our presentations of soils and territories for the multiplicity of beings that compose them. So instead of detailing each model, I will try to explain how they have been made. So Terra Forma draws on 2 methods or concepts. First is a change of gaze, and second is a map making in the field. So I will focus in this first concept of change of gaze to use new optical instruments to see differently. So we have been very inspired by the work of Robert Hooke, a scientist, who invented the microscope and through it unpacked previously invisible worlds such as the dust or the insects, who he has seen from a very narrow window. So the first change of gaze in Terra Forma is suggests to no longer looking at the landscape from above, as a traditional map does, but instead looking at the landscape from below, from the subsurface to the ground, from the bottom to the top. So here is a soil map. In urban planning, the ground is a surface that we share with the land register. It is a fictitious boundary, a line on a piece of paper that attributes or denies the power to inhabit. But we now know that the effect of our actions, especially our waste, is not limited to the surface, but flows into the soil, accumulates below it, and changes the chemistry of rocks and organisms. We therefore propose to direct our attention, our gaze, to the soil, but also towards the sky, at least as far as the canopy, the limit where life can develop, the limit of the critical zone. We will now explore a speculative ground by following the different levels of this soil map. In the first meter, matter is buzzing with movements. The soil is composed of a multitude of organic particles. The surface in cover to 1 meter depth is cut by micro cracks and weighs a few thousand tons. In some places, however, there is nothing. The soil is dead, not empty, but nothing is moving. Instead, more or less whole pieces of rubble sink deeper. Down 5 meters, we follow the galleries of moles and the burrows of small mammals that guide us back to the surface. The gallery is interrupted here and there by concrete sarcophages, tanks, apparently connected by a network of pipelines. Between the tanks, water infiltrates and drains their contents more deeply. Deeper, down 10 meters, we discover the remains of old, wide, rectangular constructions. They are compacting the soil and mixing with the rocks. In the other half of the map, the roots have already brought these ruins back to the surface, as if they were no longer welcome in the underworld. However, most of the time, the inhabitant organisms native to the natural soil and the hosted objects, anthropogenic objects, cohabit in the first levels. At 50-meter depth, it is no longer possible to discern the sources of each, as chemistry performs transformations on organisms and materials. At 100-meter depth, the rocks bear witness to a final state of matter. The extension of the human grip is readable not only horizontally but vertically in the accumulation of human actions that have penetrated the ground to the deepest strata. The map makes it possible to visualize the constant flows between the different levels of the soil, a fluidity that is rarely associated with the earth. Here, a landslide has caused two strata to meet, thus two times that should never have met. Elsewhere, the infiltration of toxic substances took place via water to the point of contaminating the water tables. So this text was an extract from the book, Terra, Forma, that can be destabilizing if one is not prepared for this gaze reversal. So this is why in the book, we also present the explanatory diagrams that describe the manufacturing process as in a manual, which then leads to the model and then allow to map any place you wish to observe. So the book explains each step to build this soil model. And this map is actually an answer to a problem raised by earth scientists, the ones that study the critical zone and who complain that the object of study, the soil, the rocks, the atmosphere, the critical zone, were actually not represented on the globe. Because the critical zone is in fact only the thin biofilm, the thin zone that is invisible at Earth scale. In the history, some projects like the Georama also attempted to change the point of view and to make people enter inside the globe. Cartographically, that can be achieved by 3 steps. 1, by cutting the globe from the inside. We show its cross-section, but here we can see the critical zone, which is squeezed at this Earth scale, in the soil and the atmosphere. So in the step 2, we reverse this Earth as a globe to overcome this critical zone invisibility. And so the crust appears at the periphery in step 3, which led a wide gap to better represent the layers that are important to us, that is the soils and the atmosphere, which are now at the center of the map, of the diagram. So this is a kind of anamorphosis to pass from the globe to the critical zone, which shows a different representation of the Earth. And so by actually putting the atmosphere at the center, it strengthens the idea that there are Earth boundaries and that the pollutants that are released into the atmosphere, such as CO2 or nitrogen, don't escape in the infinite universe, but stay there, imprisoned in the planet boundaries. So to sum up with the model, we aim at passing from a situation of being on the globe to a situation of being inside the Earth. And we change our orientation reference frame from the north towards the soil, as the map is constructed from below. So the objective was also to visualize more organisms that sustain the soil and more anthropogenic objects that are buried in purpose sometimes to make them disappear. Now in this second part, I will describe how pragmatically this model could become a way to explore the critical zone, and I will also explain what is exactly this critical zone. So using the aerial maps recurrently, we kind of lost the practice of cartography and the process necessary for its elaboration. The different tools, the gestures, the relationship to the site, and to the multiple contacts in the field. So rediscovering the practice of cartography means returning to the field, moving from place to place. This is why we like to describe the practice as an inquiry, and it raises essential questions. Who gives us the information? How to collect the data? How to record what we observed? How to make it shareable, and how to adapt the cartographic reference system to the territory's challenges. So making a map of the critical zone requires to stay in their field work and to follow the scientists at work in their observatory, like here, what Latour calls following the course of science in action. So now I would like to take you on the field and through some of the characteristics of the critical zone observatory. So you are going to see in the video the River Lab, an instrument which is a construction of river and laboratory, because it is actually a fully equipped laboratory set up in a landscape, and more precisely in an observatory of the critical zone. A critical zone observatory is a watershed equipped with scientist instruments that give new insight into the complexity of the soil, from the bedrock to the canopy of the trees that draw their nutrients from these rocks. And the critical zone is a thin layer of the planet Earth that is modified and maintained habitable by living beings, as we've seen with the Gaia hypothesis. But as this process is poorly known in terms of reactions, variations, and evolutions, an interdisciplinary scientific program of the Earth has been initiated to study it in observatories located at different places on Earth, where instruments are deployed directly in the landscape. And so this new outdoor laboratory facility contributes to the construction of a new way of looking at the Earth. For example, this river lab allows the scientists to accurately record the variations in the chemical elements of the river every 20 minutes. It's a kind of microscope, like Hooke, but for geochemistry, that decomposes the river into as many particles as there are inside a drop of water. And so we learn with the scientists that water is not a single flow, and the river is not just a river of water, but a river of many elements. And so that there is a river of sulfur, a river of phosphorus, of calcium, of magnesium. So there is as many rivers as there are elements in a drop of water. And for the critical zone exhibition, we made the symphony of this river by working with the compositor with the data of the scientists. So I don't have the time to spend the whole symphony, but it's available on the website of the critical zone, and I will show you the link afterwards. Coming back to what the scientists do inside the critical zone, these are as two images which they use to introduce their observatory. And what is interesting is the instrumented aspect. So you have a flux tower that record variations of the temperature of the atmosphere, piezometers that measure water at depth, chemical tracers to understand the composition of the rivers. Scientists take soil and water samples. They use geophones to probe soil at depth. So this is this kind of instrumented landscape that is the observatory. In the field, the visit of the observatory is not random at all, as it involves taking a tour of the instrument with the scientists, where they show us how they work, how the instruments enable them to record environmental changes, and how they travel from the field to their laboratory. And so, thanks to a close collaboration with them, with their data and the knowledge we were able to get from their instruments, we made the soil map of an observatory which is situated in the Vosges forest at the German-French border. So this is actually the watershed equipped with the scientist instrument. But instead of traditionally cartographic the instrument or the landscape as it is, so we made a map using the template, the model that I show later. And in this map, you see the blue instruments, the blue elements, which are actually the instruments that are actually in the observatory. And each one of them enables to see a characteristic of the landscape. It could be the porosity of the soil, the chemistry of the river, the composition of the atmosphere, etc. And what the scientists are actually measuring in this observatory is how the environment reacts to past acid rains, which are still causing forest depletion and death of the trees. So this is a short video of the website of the Critical Zone exhibition at the ZKM, when you can open the soil map. And I will briefly describe it. You guys may be attracted to the microspheres, the atmosphere, the soil, the deep rocks, or perhaps you may focus your attention to the microelements that offer a molecular view of the landscape. Perhaps you will be confused by the jumps of scales, or perhaps you will understand that the landscape is not something that can be scaled up or scaled down easily, but there is no scale, actually, order or hierarchy, and that a microorganism actually creates a large and immense mountain, as is the case in this landscape in the Vosges forest. You will notice a deep soil that takes up almost all the surface, or rather the depth of the map, but that the rocks are somewhat decomposed, or rather fractured as a cracked building. Rocks are indeed eroded, and erosion produces nutrients for plants. Weathering, a process in which rocks are transformed into particles, creates nutrients, which slowly rises to the surface and make up the soft soil. And you actually found out by talking to the scientists that the tiny little stream that the River Lab monitors is called Strembach, meaning strength in German. Then by following the drawing on the map, you may also see turbulent reactions in the atmosphere, something very dense, very oppressive above you. But when you are in the observatory, you didn't actually see anything, just a white sky. But then you look at some of the instruments that the scientists put on the field, the gutters, and the scientists explain to you that they are analyzing the water that has passed through the leaves, the so-called fruitfall, and that by analyzing the water, they can decipher how much sulfur or CO2 is in the atmosphere. The results show that there is a lot of sulfur coming from the atmosphere and seeping into the soil. Sulfur has indeed an important effect on trees. It causes nutrients to leave the soil through chemical reactions. So the trees have no more food. Even if you can't see it, other tools can decipher it. And so if you want to make these things visible, you need to rely on these instruments. This cloud doesn't stay in one place and come from other regions, but as you know, the Earth is round. The atmospheric circulation and what it carries doesn't evaporate, but stays and revolves around the Earth. So this sulfur coming from Asia in 20 days is actually raining under the Vosges forest. In order to make visible this geochemical process, we work on a different visualization with the scientists to actually draw the impact of the sulfur element, so this chemical which is causing acid rain and which is coming from faraway factories. So again, with the background of the soil critical zone model, we set up a grammar of signs to describe the shape of the sulfur cycles. This shows the trajectory of the sulfur through the layers of the critical zone, from the atmosphere to the rocks or from the rocks to the atmosphere. It thus shows the way, but also the quantity and the speed at which the sulfur is passing through. If the sulfur spends a lot of time in one of the layers, then the angle of the spiral is flat. And on the contrary, if the sulfur is moving faster, then the angle is nearly perpendicular, as it is the case here with the number 7 and 8, which represent mining and fossil fuel combustion, which are producing more sulfur than the system can absorb. And so thanks to this visualization, we can see human disturbances on biogeochemical cycles that we called geography, which is actually the human signature in the Anthropocene. So you see how, depending on the collaborators we work with, scientists or science historians or architects, the initial model is used for different purposes and slightly adapt to answer to each question. And so last year, we have been asked to participate in the Critical Zone exhibition at the Deadcame Center for Art and Media in Karlsruhe, in Germany. Bruno Latour and Peter Webel, the two curators, commissioned us to make a representation of an observatory of the critical zone. The map and the animation that we were just see were there, but we were asked to go further and to create a space where people could actually be inside the critical zone. So as we were impressed by our field experience with the scientists, we wanted that the public would experience the landscape as if they were in the field, in front of the instruments. This instrument which gave a completely different experience of what is the landscape, such as a river lab that we listened earlier, and that shows the river under other aspects. But first, I will read the text that you normally find at the entrance of the space before discovering the show. So when a sick person enters an intensive care unit, the first thing caregivers do is to apply multiple instruments to get a good reading of the main variables that will help physicians to monitor the patient's condition. In the same way, it's necessary to devise critical zone observatory for the Earth, to monitor all of the different parts that compose the fragile and complex domain of the critical zone, and to come to understand how it has worked in the past and how it is going to cope in the future with human activity. You are going to enter into one of those critical zone observatory. We have chosen the Strembar Observatory, set up in the Vosges, near the village of Aubure, 150 kilometers from Karlsruhe. Through the equipment of many instruments, it has become a sort of outdoor laboratory covering 80 hectares, getting data from the top of the tree canopy to 150 meters underground. Warning: this view of Aubure is very different from a tourist view of a Vosges landscape. Rather, we want you to experience as close as possible how scientists themselves follow the behavior of some of the phenomena making up a landscape. the water cycle, forest evolution, chemical weathering, patterns of rain. Most elements that sustain this landscape are invisible, except through long-term data accumulation and close monitoring. A critical zone observatory is composed of multiple sensors that give scientists another feel for the land. Those are the feelings we need to share with the scientists, just as a villager of Oberdu, because this is the only way to establish feedback between what we are doing to the soil we live on and how the soil reacts to our collective actions. So we reconstitute the watershed of the observatory inside this large courtyard of the museum, but only with the instruments that are present in the field. So we actually recreate or import the instruments that are in the observatory inside the museum, or reconstitute them. And the whole set of instruments are actually making the shape of the landscape, the shape of the topography of this watershed. So remember the soil map making from below that I presented. This is actually here the same principle. So the ground surface is above you, and you explore what is this underground landscape that the scientists monitor with piezometer, gravimeter, or geophones. And this long tubular section suspended above you stand for the geophysic instruments. The geophysic instruments send waves into the ground to reconstitute its compositions. And so actually these scientific imageries making by the scientists are also projected in the space. And so the public walk under these sections because actually the ground floor of the museum is underground. And one of the instruments I particularly enjoy is the gravimeter, which records the variation of the water table at depth. But this instrument is so sensitive that it can also hear the impact of the tide of the North Sea coast situated at 100 kilometers away from the forest where it is actually located. And so in the upper level of the installation, the visitor can also find the instruments that monitor the upper layers of the critical zone, notably the trees or the weather. And the instruments used by the scientists are fragile, precarious, sometimes just attached by cables to damaged trees. And some are also confidential, hiding in the landscape. And that what we also intended to show and also to make visible. And we also intended to show the landscape as seen by the critical zone. It's kind of abstract, but it is also precise because it's enabled to see previously hidden entities or to question the landscape that we once took for granted. And the necessity for navigating from one instrument to another was also important to get these other feelings of what is a terrestrial. So this is a view for from the stairs, where you can see the whole watershed instrumented. And here are some images with the maps displayed. So the exhibition is larger than this installation, and great artworks are presented, such as Sarase. So it's open until August, but maybe you can go there from the US. But you can also visit the virtual exhibition, and there is also many tours given by the ZKM, virtual tours, which are very interesting to follow. And so to come back to the Terra Forma book and to open it to the workshop, I just wanted to give you a hint on the different models. I will not have time to deploy them, but I can just give you some indication on the question they are dealing with. So in addition to the soil model, the book developed 6 other models. So there are 7 chapters in total. And each chapter presents a map, which is a result of a new model to visualize a specific question. And so the 7 chapters are point of view on reality, possible visions of the world sketched by different prisms, like many optical instruments, the death, the movements, the point of life, border, rhythms, or memories. And so the book, it's also important, is writing as an exploration narrative, but it's also drawing models, a drawing manual. So it encourages the reader to explore techniques of representation on various sites. So this is the living point model. The idea here was to actually represent the terrain of life of a living being, starting from its skin and going down to the world. This is the living landscape. Living landscape. The idea was here to follow the life territory of different beings, which could be human or non-humans, from microorganisms to wildcats and bats, and to try to find the places of interaction and especially geometric signatures. For example, what would be the life territory of an architect compared to oil, for example, and what are their interactions, if any. The borders model, in this one, we twist the geographical reference frame of the border very literally, so that there is no longer a delimitation, but a continuum of milieu, of spaces, as it is the case in reality, because we cross continuums of living environments. The space-time model, so here the question was, how can we represent the superimposed rhythms of life, particularly in metropolitan areas, the moment of synchronization or desynchronization, and how time makes space plastic, and how could we design an architecture with this plasticity of the rhythms of time. In the model sources or resources, it actually evokes the ghostly landscape of exploitations. And how can we get away from the conception of resources, such as extraction, and how can we redeploy the sources of the territory? And the last one, the memories model, asks the question, how can we rethink possible futures based on ruined landscapes and Anthropocene fossils? So this last model actually takes into account the collateral effects of development of the out of control by trying to build a tool to recognize these ghostly landscapes, but also to be able to open up potential times and spaces. So we are now developing the Terra Forma workshops that are participative, experimental, cartographic, trying to, let's say, rewriting the terrestrial. So this workshop proposed to involve the public in the cartographic enterprise itself, and is conceived as a tool for empowerment and cartographic notation as a grammar of a new understanding and experience of the world. So this series of workshops are proposed in different contexts and with different audiences. And the aim is gradually and collectively build up a kind of atlas based on the tools proposed in the book. And through the series of workshops we have organized since the distribution of the manual, we have been very struck by the diversity and heterogeneity of the map that we can get, even with the same model or even in the same territory. So here are some schemes of the workshops. And just maybe to finish on the objective of this workshop, so there is a kind of 5 points. One is to raise environmental awareness through the description of individual living areas, soils, and landscape. It's also to experience other ways of designing the territory. It's also to experience disorientation, but also to draw the soil from new data types and to define our bond of attachments and territorial subsistence. So sometimes it becomes difficult to superimpose all the drawings, and we say how it implies to make choices and to make also an effort to coexist in this different space. And it's also a way to discuss with actors that don't always have a voice or that are not necessarily in contact to each other. So it's a kind of space, an open space where we're reading or we're rewriting the territories, and the narrative part is also important. So each new map or each new drawing have to be followed by a description, a writing description, which tells the story, the different story of what could be the soil or the terrestrial in the Anthropocene era. Sorry. And yeah, to finish, maybe this has some results of the workshop drawing by students of ETH Zurich in Switzerland. So each student develops a map, so on different sites, observe different landscapes, different things, different soils, different rivers or trees or cities. And interestingly, is the way we can share the different mappings that we are collected in the same model. So it is all with the same soil map model. And we realize also here that we didn't expect such diversity or variety with the same model. So maybe to conclude, I hope that through these examples, I have succeeded in sharing with you the potential of visualizations to help set up a space where scientists, architects, researchers can work together, share their concerns and questions. And I just wanted to insist on this plasticity and this potential capacity, perhaps subversive too, of the map to be reinvented and to trigger new representations of territories, landscapes, or the Earth. And the critical zone is indeed a cosmological revolution. We are not floating in the infinite universe as the globe intended to demonstrate. Where we live, inside the Earth, rocks, atmosphere, trees, waters, are linked and intertwined in complex and as yet unknown patterns that the scientists trying to discover. Not only do we evolve within these layers, but they also intermingled, such as the composition of the atmosphere, which is directly linked to the metamorphosis of the rocks. And rocks are, in this visualization, the ultimate sphere. As for the atmosphere, it is volatile, short-lived, and we move directly through it, ingesting, inspiring, and exhaling it. It is a fragile and central sphere for us that we certainly neglect as much as the soils, whose composition we do not even know in the first few meters, yet which supports all forms of life. So I hope that we will be able to experiment this little exercise with the model, and I will be happy to see the results during this week. And for now, I will be happy to answer any questions. And I'm sorry if maybe I get too fast.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was really amazing, really inspiring from many perspectives. Thank you. Yes, so we do have some questions already that we can start to talk about. one from a student, Jacob Mala, who writes, very beautiful maps. Do you find very beautiful maps? Do you find your maps of the critical zone a method of recording, or do you find them as a way of engaging and questioning the zone and the Anthropocene? Are these maps meant to suggest change to the Earth, bring up questions of responsibility? Who is responsible for this change and who is meant to fix it? Can we fix it?
Okay. So I would say that we cannot fix maybe the I read again this. Yeah, so regarding the purpose of the critical the map of the critical zone, so as maybe I said it, but a little bit fast in the lecture. So it has been designed with the scientists themselves. We face a kind of problem or issue regarding the visualization of this critical zone, which was squeezed at the Earth of the scale, and so I started to collaborate with them to help them visualize it. And in exchange, I also discovered a new way, actually, of looking at the landscape or at the Earth. So it's a kind of exchange which question what is this zone, what is the Earth also, which is not really the globe. I will not. Yeah, Bruno Latour talks a lot about this also. The 7 planets, which the globe is one of them, but we always have different representations of the Earth, and the critical zone or the terrestrial could be one of them. Then how is it meant to fix it? I don't know if you are talking about geoengineering, because yeah, we are responsible for the change.
I think maybe it's a question of, you said that the maps was a way to help the observatory visualize what they were studying and observing. Maybe the question is, what further forums or audience might appreciate this kind of visualization?
Yeah, I don't know, because the question of responsibility is a bit tricky, as the Anthropocene, is also a controversial term, which tends to encompass all human condition, but there is many terms, Capitalocene or Plantationocene, Stulocene, which also brought by feminists who try to pinpoint who is really responsible for the damages. But I think I don't get the question. Yeah,
that's okay. We can go to the next one. Hopefully it brings a good conversation. This is from Athar Mufreh. You can also read it. I think you will find it in the Q&A box. I'm fascinated with the intelligent method of cartographic mapping of the terrestrial. I especially admire the drawings that show the cycles of living beings and other pollutants in motion. Beyond understanding and exposing the invisible geologic layers, it seems to me that the benefit of this way of mapping is to constantly monitor the transformations of an area. Do you think this method requires a constant monitoring of the critical zone as it's always changing? What would be the method to collect information and produce drawings based on this continuity?
Yeah, that's right. It's not really changed continuously. I mean, it's could change over the years, but because there is a lag between the soil for the soil to recover. So it's not like in days, but you can see. That's why also the critical zone is a long-term observation monitoring, because it has to be monitored for a long time to see the changes. And so actually the map of the cycles are also try to show this long-term monitoring. And as it's rightly said, that maps are always a time, like it's also a version of a space. They are not immutable, but it's really about changes. And for actually, for example, I didn't show it, but for the sulfur cycles, we show these cycles in the 1985 and in 2010. And there is a difference between the two of them in terms of quantity of sulfur in this Vosges forest. And you can see it in the website of the that I show you.
Thank you. Amazing. There's another question which maybe I will also expand a little bit, asking about cultural perception or cultural understanding, cultural conceptions about how we view water or other, ecological process or beings. And I'm really struck by that in your work and presentation. It really seems to suggest a kind of environmental understanding and environmentality that escapes from some of the traditional cartographic understanding and the cultural habits and customs of how to make sense of environment. It's much more complex and involved. I guess the question that is also posed here is how does it relate to cultural aspects from different cultural perspectives? How does this work connect to how different cultures understand their nature culture worldview or point of life, as you call it.
Yeah, totally. I'm unfortunately my point of view is Western Western citizens, but there is Aboriginal maps are really. I was really surprised when I saw this kind of map. It shows the path and how the landscape are making by big entities that one day curves the earth or moves the soil that's in making mountains. And it appears from a different culture, and also because we are now very influenced by each other. And one of the things also was also to decenter the gaze and maybe to try to be more cosmopolitical in the way we represent or visualize, even if we always stand from a point of view, from a situated knowledge, as Donna Haraway would put it. That is, if you say where we are and from which you represent or see the territory of the world, it's always better than just saying that there is an homogeneous or a point of view which is possibly looking for everything, which is not obviously the case. We are always situated in some point.
Thank you. Incredible responses. We don't have yet another question, so I can pose one, but if someone from the audience wants to formulate something, please feel free to pose it in the box. My question is that I'm so captivated by how your work challenges the established ideas of how to intervene, how to represent, because your work is accounting for all of the things that traditionally haven't been accounted for. And instead of discrete sites where we can put our focus, you talk about continuity and continuum between different scales, between different, from the atmosphere into the soil, and somehow this methods of intervention that we have today, at least in the current architectural field, has not caught up to this cosmological revolution that I think you are helping to describe. What might be some of the changes that you think, maybe, I don't know if it's too premature because you didn't focus on this, but what might be some of the changes that we should account for when we come to the point of saying how to intervene, given this cosmological, new cosmological condition that we now are starting to recognize or find a way to represent?
Yeah, thanks. I think starting from looking at the depth or also the soil beneath our feet or under which we build our constructions and city, etc. This is also, it's not just the surface, but really what's going on at depth, because it has an implication of what is going on in the atmosphere. It's linked, as we see in cycles. And the other thing, or the other maybe is to work more with the scientists. I mean, in architecture, I didn't have the chance to work with earth scientists, and I think it was really missing in my curriculum. And so, yeah, and visiting also their field works, their observatories, and how they link also to citizens, because they work on territories which are inhabited, and especially in Europe. In US, it's a little different. But yeah, and how we can also, as architects, being in this community of scientists and citizens and associations on the question of environment.
That's very interesting. Thank you. The cycles and different timescales and different forms of partnership, I think it's really fascinating.
Yeah, timescales also, exactly. I didn't speak about it, but yeah, this is something that we just focus sometimes on space, but actually in my practice before. And it's missed also because the Anthropocene is a very long time scale, and sometimes it's escape our understanding as a human scale. So yeah, that's a good.
We have a question also in YouTube, actually many questions in YouTube. Let's see, maybe we can start with this one. It's more specifically about the geographic drawing model, the soil map. The inversion of the layers seems to me to be an extension of anthropocentric worldview. Is the human at the center? Does it displace the planet as a center of inquiry?
Okay. So the gaze is indeed at the center, but we can't presume. It's our gaze. As I said before, it's a situated knowledge. So if we represent the things from our point of view, but we can represent much more entities that there is in cartographic representations as there are, I think, now. And so the reversal of is kind of putting the rocks as a periphery and the atmosphere as a center. It's also to give more space to the soil in between, and all entities or all organisms or objects that are composing the soil or composting the soil, so to speak. I think this is what is maybe a little displacement from an anthropocentric view to more cosmopolitical view, to understand the large parts of what is composing a territory or small scale or earth scale.
Thank you. Yes, very fascinating. More questions from the students. This is your open forum, so take advantage. Let's see, another question. Maybe this question from YouTube. Which I guess is a more conceptual, theoretical question. Maybe is the concept of nature, which seems to be very complicated, traditional concept, which is complicated here. How to, yes, I guess maybe it's a question of what kind of concepts, terms, or lexicon can assist in the critical zone where everything is somehow altered by human intervention in some way. Where if traditionally nature is the thing that we can describe as separate from culture, but now in the critical zone, somehow everything is mixed and there's no distinguishing. Yes, you could speak about this or your perspective on this and what kind of terms can help engage with that reality.
Yeah, so nature is, it's actually a concept also created or invented to also put the political is human and nature is out there, is like a background for human activities, but it's not really implicated in human actions or human politics. And that's, so there is a book for Bruno Latour, especially on this subject, and how actually nature was always implicated in political decisions or activities and were never been a background. So the fact that it has become the background, it's a Western point of view between the separation between culture and nature, and in other over civilization, for example, you don't have this in totemism or analogism, animism. I mean, and there is now a lot of ethnographists or anthropologists who are, I can quote them, Anat Singh, for example, Nastasia Martin, but she is French. It's very difficult to read, who say that, yeah, this division is really an artifact, and that we always deal with natural political things. And the Anthropocene show that very, very abruptly, because, you know, the human activities have become a geological force, so that you cannot distinguish what is part of human processes and or natural processes. And maybe you can see the difference of this gradient in the shape of the cycles or something like that. But it's not really a division, it's how much humans are disturbing natural processes, I would say. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Alexandra. We have one more question that disappeared. Your graphic representations are nuanced and complex. How do you think about the time and process of reading diagrams as an aspect of their message? Is a process of discovery important? It seems like the process of reading the graphics mirrors the investigative work that produced them.
Yeah, but very interesting. Yeah. I would say the two of them are combined. They worked together. I mean, I'm doing research in writing, but I think visualization and diagramming are conceptual schemes that helps to formulate questions, or also to talk with the scientists, because we don't have the same background or language. And so sometimes I also use visualization to just talk to them, because they are also used to deal with this diagrams or visuals. And yeah, it's really drives the research, the inquiry. Yeah, it's really they go hand in hand.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. I think we will wrap up here, but I want to thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to welcome you in this week and in this platform. And I think what is so striking about your work, among many different things, is this dedication and ambition to reinvent, recreate the visual tools that we use that are so important to understanding. And without reinventing these, somehow the conceptions and perceptions about environment certainly won't change. So I think your drawings and work is a prompt really for a lot of new thinking and appreciation and sensitivity for environment today. So incredibly inspiring. Thank you so much. And also the use of the motion graphics, it's really compelling to get it across instead of a kind of static cartographic base. Really wonderful. So thank you again so much. And after this, we have the beginning of the workshop. So we're looking forward to this. And anyone who's tuned in now, we have 2 more public lectures tomorrow. So please tune into those, check out the website, and we'll have another session then. So thank you again. Thanks to everyone here, and take care.
Thank you.